Wait, North Carolina, right, because you were at Elon.
So at Elon,
right,
and then came here.
So I went to school at Duke.
Okay, yeah.
And spent a lot of time in North Carolina. Worked on a campaign, actually, for a guy who, you're too young to know who he is, but he's a former governor of North Carolina who became a United States Senator there. His name was Terry Sanford.
Okay.
And so I got to work for him while I was in college, and then he hired me to go work on Capitol Hill when he won for United States Senate, and I had this great position for a little while on Capitol Hill. I was the youngest legislative assistant in the U.S. Senate, and then worked for Alan Dixon, who's a former senator from here.
North Carolina ties.
Yeah.
Miss NC, miss it. Not more than Georgia, but definitely miss it.
Yeah.
All right, sir. Well, we'll go ahead because I know your time is precious as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. They'll cue me up, and we'll go from there. All right. 3, 2, and 1. Well, welcome back. The election to see who will be the next governor of Illinois is just literally less than 2 weeks away, the biggest in our state's history. And joining me now is Democratic candidate for governor JB Pritzker, here to talk about just a few things on the campaign and also what you and why you believe you should be the next governor of Illinois. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on.
I want to start local. Peoria for the last several years has been listed in a study as one of the worst cities for African Americans, citing wages and jobs. For you, what do you plan to do to help minorities, particularly within job growth, business development, and financially?
Well, I'm really proud that my running mate and I, Juliana Stratton, who's a state representative, that we put forward an economic inclusion plan that I think will lift up communities of color all across the state of Illinois. You know that most jobs that get created in the state are created by small businesses and startup businesses. So our plan includes providing capital and technical assistance and mentorship for people in communities where frankly, people have been left behind and just forgotten about. And I want to make sure that the creativity and entrepreneurial capability of people in communities like Peoria have the ability to start businesses, because that's where most of the jobs come from. So we need to work on that. We need to make sure that we're at the state government level, we're not only having an inclusive and diverse staff and administration, but also that we're focused on bringing economic development dollars to Peoria. And I've worked with your state representative here, Jahan Gordon Booth, with your state senator here, to make sure that we're focused on what the right things are to create jobs in Peoria. Last thing I'd tell you is that state government has a lot of dollars that it spends procuring things for its needs, services and goods for the government. And yet, most of those contracts really haven't gone to people of color. It's time for us to have a real effort in that regard, and I want to make sure that the contracts that are available at state government are going to communities that need them the most.
All right, well, as you're aware, because it has also a Peoria tie, there was a lawsuit that was filed against your campaign by former staffers claiming racial discrimination. They said they weren't being treated the same as white staffers. And even here in Peoria, one of those people said that there were issues with where they were staying, that that those concerns had not been addressed. I know your campaign has released a statement, but to hear it from you as well,
sure.
What is your response to those allegations in that lawsuit?
Well, thanks for bringing them up. And truthfully, the claims are false. And I think we saw some of the facts about the claims around Peoria have come out and shown those claims to be false as well. I'm very proud of the campaign that we put together. We have probably the most diverse campaign staff that you can have on a statewide basis. A majority of the senior staff that we have are people of color and women. 45% of the overall staff statewide are people of color. We've run a really great campaign that's been centered around equality and inclusion and diversity, and we intend to have the most diverse staff and most diverse administration in the history of the state of Illinois. Juliana and I have been dedicated to that from day one, and we're going to make sure and carry it out when we get elected.
All right, well, let's talk taxes. You've been a huge proponent of a progressive and a graduated kind of income tax here, but one of the things, to my knowledge, we still haven't heard exactly how that will look. You said that it would raise for the wealthy. Who qualifies underneath that to have increased taxes, and are you willing, as we're 2 weeks really away from the election, people are making their final decisions, to say what that actually looks like?
Well, let's talk about who's going to have their taxes lowered, because that's really the most important thing about it, and that's the middle class and those striving to get to the middle class. We want to lower their income taxes, and we want to lower property taxes for everybody. We can do that. We have a very unfair tax system. In fact, it's been called out, Illinois' tax system, as the most unfair in the nation. That's what Governor Rauner is defending, this unfair tax system. I want to change it, make it fairer, make sure middle-class families and those striving to get there have real opportunity and dollars back in their pockets. And that means making sure that the wealthiest people in the state, like Bruce Rauner and me, pay a little bit more, and that the rest of everybody pays less. You know, I want to make sure that the vast majority of people in the state get a tax break. I want to just define for you what it looks like today in the state. People who are in the middle class and those striving to get there are paying between 11.5% and 13 or 14% of their incomes in all the state tax burden that falls on them, including property taxes, sales taxes, the flat income tax. And people at the top are paying half of that. So people in the middle paying, 11, 12, people at the bottom who are paying taxes 13, 14%, people at the top paying 6 or 7%. That's just not fair. We ought to make it fairer. And we ought to change the way we fund schools in the state to lower local property taxes, and that's really the goal of our plan.
You gave the specifics on what it currently looks like, but any specifics on what your plan will look like to make it more fair? Any numbers that you've already started to think about that you would press forward?
Well, remember, the most important thing about it is making it fairer, and that means we've got to get input from the legislature, negotiate it with the legislature, and here's the critical thing, because it really does require a constitutional amendment to get this done. We're going to have to get a supermajority of the voters to support it. And in order to do that, we're going to get input from everybody to determine what the rates ought to be and what the break points ought to be at what income levels. And that's how we'll come up with the system that we need. But here, when we need to talk about, revenue for the state, we should be talking about job creation. Because, you bring jobs into the state, you attract companies to the state, help people start businesses. People are going to pay taxes when they have jobs, right? But only when they have jobs. Bruce Rauner has been an utter and complete failure at job creation in the state. He called his predecessor a miserable failure, and he's created fewer jobs than that. We should do a lot better than that. And I've spent my life helping people start and build businesses. My career, anyway, has been in this. I founded 1871, which is now the world's best small business incubator right here in Illinois. It's created 7,000 jobs and hundreds of companies. We can do that all across the state. I've also done it in my own business, created thousands of jobs. It's really important that we focus on revenue enhancement by creating jobs in our state and growing the economy.
Well, I know a lot of people, part of those jobs is unions, right? So unions is a large part of that, particularly within the state of Illinois. There's a lot of disagreement on what should happen with unions. You've been a supporter of unions. But I do want to bring out a recent report that showed that, that there was non-union work that was used on one of your properties, on a $25 million project on one of your homes. I just want to give you, again, a chance to respond to those people who see that report and see that and say, well, I thought, JB supports unions.
Well, remember that this is Bruce Rauner trying to distract from his own terrible record with regard to unions. With regard to my home, vast majority of everything that was done on the home was done with union labor. There were definitely a few subcontractors, and someone called those out to the attention of a newspaper, and they wrote a story about it. But I'm a big supporter of labor. I want to make sure that we have good wages in the state. Our labor unions are fighting for the middle class. They're fighting for working families. We ought to be standing up for them. Bruce Rauner has been trying to tear down the labor unions and lower wages for people in the state. I just think that's wrong. You ought to have a governor who wakes up every day thinking about how to make people's lives better, how to lift up their wages and their standard of living. And that's been the focus of my campaign, raising up people's standards of living, raising their wages, creating jobs so there's more competition for labor so that they have real opportunity, lowering the cost of health care, and I put a plan forward that does that and helps us expand coverage, and then finally lowering the cost of higher education so that people can send their kids to college without getting strapped with debt for the rest of their lives. thousands of dollars back on the table for middle-class families. That's what I'm focused on.
Okay, and you've mentioned Governor Rauner. There's, it's no secret. There's no lost love between the two of you throughout this campaign. You've both kind of hit back at each other as you've gone through. There have been ads that have been shared, and there's a lot of conversation about the ads that you guys have put out against each other. For your governing style, if you were to be elected, just looking at this campaign, is that any reflection on what would happen if you were to be elected governor and you faced opposition?
Well, there's a real contrast between Bruce Rauner and me. You know that he's been in office now for almost 4 years. The first 2 years, unwilling to work with Democrats to get a budget for the state, literally walked out of the room unwilling to get something done. We went 2 years without a budget, longer than any state ever in the history of the United States. Then he vetoed the third year's budget, and so frustrated were his fellow Republicans with him that they crossed over and worked with Democrats to actually override his veto. So Bruce Rauner's proven that he is unable to work with people. I, on the other hand, have a real history of getting big things done for working families by working together with people, by bringing people together to solve big problems, whether it was creating that world-renowned small business incubator or by lowering the cost of child care and preschool. In fact, I want to make it universal for everybody. And I've worked on that for more than 20 years to make sure that our most at-risk kids have the same opportunity as wealthy people in the state to get a good education at a young age. And you know that I led the effort to build a museum that 120,000 children and adults attend every year that helps to teach about fighting bigotry and hatred and intolerance. I ran the Illinois Human Rights Commission. These are all things that I've worked together with people. You know, the Human Rights Commission is an interesting example. Half Republican, half Democrat. I worked with both sides to improve the commission. In fact, it really needed to be reformed. And we did that together. And some of those Republicans on that commission are supporting me in this gubernatorial race because they've seen me work together on both sides of the aisle. I intend to be that kind of governor. That's something Bruce Rauner's proven he's not.
All right, well, a quick question, just switching subject, legalizing marijuana as well. There's other states that have already done this, other states that are mulling it over. It's been a huge debate here for a number of years now within the state of Illinois. Your stance, you've been a supporter. What could that possibly do for the state of Illinois? Would you ensure that that is pushed through if you are to be elected?
Well, this is another example of a big difference between Bruce Rauner and me. First of all, he hasn't even wanted to allow people with severe medical conditions to be able to access medical marijuana, medical cannabis, and he pushed against that for a number of years and only recently had to sign a bill because it was overwhelmingly supported by the legislature. I also want to legalize it for recreational purposes. He opposes that. And the reason I do is really threefold. One is criminal justice reform. The laws are being prosecuted unevenly and against people of color. We should just do away with it. It's so readily available today, even though it's illegal. How about if we regulate it? And the second big reason I'm getting to is safety. You've heard about all the people who died from synthetic marijuana and the possibility of unsafe product that's being sold to people in an illegal fashion. Why don't we regulate and make it safe for people? And that way we can keep it out of the hands of people who shouldn't have it. And then the third thing is we can bring $700 million of tax revenue to the state, maybe more in my estimation. Look at the other states that have put it in place. We're not the first. And we can look at the regulatory systems like the one in Washington State, which has been so successful, and we could bring that sort of system, having seen it work there successfully, to the state of Illinois.
Well, Mr. Pritzker, I have two more questions for you. The first is just on this campaign. It's almost record-breaking at this point as far as how much money has been spent in. I mean, you're very close of your own money, of, I believe, going over a national record in the history, and then together it's already breaking and shattering record books. But I also believe that you have been, and correct me if I'm wrong, you've been on record in saying that you would consider having a cap on campaign finance, looking at campaign finance reform. Looking at the amount of money that you've placed in already of your own money, what does that look like as far as having campaign finance reform? Is it a little kind of hypocritical maybe after the fact to have that conversation? So what does it look like? And well, obviously it's benefiting.
It's too bad that Bruce Rauner is the one who, long before I was a candidate in this race, he wrote himself a check to his campaign for $50 million, and then he took $20 million from a huge special interest, and that's a Koch brothers right-wing network member. You know, these are the folks that want to destroy wages and destroy working families' incomes. And, you know, I think that's just dead wrong. And I looked at this and said, look, Illinois is worth it. And so I got into this race in order to not only overcome Bruce Rauner, but make sure that we're expressing our Democratic Party values about fighting for working families, and we're putting those policies in place that will defend them. I do believe in campaign finance reform. You know, I've supported a lot of candidates over the many years that I've been involved in politics, and having worked on Capitol Hill, having, you know, supported candidates, worked on campaigns as a staff person, and a believer in these values and electing good people, many of whom could not write a check to their own campaigns, but ran and won as a result of the support they were able to get from others. And I've been one of those supporters. I think we got to go back to a day when we had real limits on what people put into campaigns. Unfortunately, the Republicans have stood foursquare against that, and that's why we've got things like Citizens United from the Supreme Court and rulings from them that have just obliterated any of the campaign finance limits that used to exist. I think here in Springfield, you know, we can get a lot done here in Illinois to reduce the impact of money. We can do some matching funds for people who raise small dollar contributions for their campaigns. I think that would be a good idea. We could change the way we have this unlimited, you know, this cap that if you break a cap, you know, all of a sudden the limits come off. That isn't really working very well, is it? Because Bruce Rauner broke the caps in the general election. Somebody else in our primary actually broke the caps in our race. I was not the one who did that. And it seems that it happened in the Chicago mayoral race already. That limit isn't working. We've got to find another way.
Okay. Last question to you here really quickly is simply this. Your opponent, Bruce Rauner, has been really critical of Mike Madigan, and has constantly said, you know, if JB goes into office,
well, that's just false. Yeah.
Okay, so that's what I want to ask right now. In the relation between you and Mike Madigan, there are people who say that if you're elected, it's really Mike Madigan who will be leading and not JB.
It's so funny to me when I hear that, because look, you know, on the one hand, I have been clear about, look, I have self-funded this campaign. Often the reasons that are cited why people are following Mike Madigan and listening to him is because he funds their campaigns. Nobody else has funded this campaign. I'm somebody who has been independent my whole life. I have fought to expand school breakfast for 230,000 kids across the state of Illinois, changing policy, working hard to do that. You know, early childhood education, something I've been doing for more than 20 years, building 1871, the small business incubator, running the Human Rights Commission. These are all things that I've done. Mike Madigan wasn't anywhere near there. I've gotten big things done for people across the state. I'm going to continue to do that. I think people should recognize that the governor doesn't get to choose who the Speaker of the House is. That gets chosen by some of the voters in a district and then by other legislators. But the governor of the state does have to work with whoever the Speaker or the President of the Senate are, and also the chairs of the various committees. And I am someone who's proven the ability to work on behalf of working families to get things done with people, even when I didn't necessarily like them or get along with them. And I'm somebody who will work across the aisle with Republicans. I remember a day in Illinois when Republicans and Democrats worked together to get things done, and I intend to bring that day back to the state.
All right, Mr. Pritzker, thank you so much for going. We're out of time now, but for answering these questions, and best of luck to you.
Thanks,
on
Eugene.
Election Day.
Appreciate it.
All right, absolutely. We'll be right back.